Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You're most welcome to our Togasi session for this month. My name is Abigail Murray. I work for the Saldanha Bay IDZ, responsible for enterprise development. The objectives of enterprise development include to increase competitiveness, to improve access to markets, and to build capacity. Today is one of those sessions where we endeavor to do that. And the strategic objectives of enterprise development includes information-based support, with the Togasi sessions is one of those, and then also the supplier awareness days that you've been part of, then business support, and sector-based support. So today's session will talk to that a bit, businesses in the same sector and how we capitalize on that. I thought this morning, and I've said it before in other sessions, I feel very spoilt with the skills of our speaker. So I wish that you join me in feeling spoiled with the expertise that we have in Benny. So enjoy the session. I'll chat to you later again. Thank you.
Good morning. You can hear me. Good morning. It's good to be back on the podium again. The last Togasi session that I delivered this year was the first one, which we had in April. And we do appreciate the support that we have from the Saldanha Bay municipal area and business community and our various stakeholders who do attend these sessions. I have a bold title today, just to look into what we call clustering. This is a topic that has become quite topical in terms of building capacity in certain sectors and areas, and it's an actual economic development tool that can be utilized. And the phrase I would like everyone to take home with today at the end of this talk is cooperate when you can and compete when you must. For those who haven't been to our Togasi series before, my name is Benedicta Mahlangu, and I am the executive for the Ease of Doing Business at the Saldanha Bay IDZ. My background is in the upstream oil and gas and marine sectors, which is how I'm able to share some of my experiences, some of my learnings, having worked offshore, having worked onshore, and now moving into my fully fledged role with regards to designing and implementing an ease of doing business framework and solution for our IDZ. And this is quite an intricate process in terms of involving public and private sector stakeholders in order to allow us to offer a value-added service to this sector. Just a bit of background, my background is I've got a chemical engineering degree, and as I've mentioned, I've worked offshore. That was on the oil rigs and vessels. And I've also worked for the global Danish shipping company Maersk. And with these experiences that I've gotten to be exposed to all over the world, it's also opened up my own viewpoints in terms of how some of the things like clustering work globally, because I would have been a part of some of that. So I hope you enjoy what I have to share with you today. The clustering concept, so I just want to give a bit of background of what is clustering and why it's important basically in our everyday lives, especially as business people. So the clustering concept is, it's seen as a tool actually that benefits the people within that particular cluster. So people have, organizations, companies, different institutions have recognized the importance of being able to work collaboratively together and in fact having a geographical proximity to each other in order to do this. It doesn't necessarily always have to be the case, but it does help. And this also ties into interdependency that you start to build in by virtue of, instead of having driven from Cape Town to Saldanha Bay for your supplies, your supplier is right next door to you, and you cut out that middle leg of your costs, for example, say would it be in logistics. And also the clustering is a very useful tool because you can share leverage on costs such as marketing. You can leverage on infrastructure because you share certain infrastructures, and that's why as the IDZ we are able to provide infrastructure for the future tenants and investors, and therefore it makes it easier, because if you individually wanted to build a road or put up a pipeline for your utilities and services, that we are a lot more costlier than when it's collectively being built together. So we, as the IDZ ourselves, are in working as in a cluster sort of concept or formation. This is just to give an example of, I would say, a more mature oil and gas and marine services cluster. The clustering can really be made of various components. It just depends what your focus is. Are you centering it around a particular industry, or is centering it around a particular organization? So if you have just a particular business, like in South Africa, we have the automotive industry cluster up in Roslyn and Pretoria, that's centered around building a car. But all the businesses around it would be the person who provides the door, the one who does the brakes, supplies the tires, supplies the leather seats. And so around this car, you actually have a cluster that's been built around it to make it sustainable, as well as provides ongoing work for these particular service providers within that cluster. So if you look at this example, just typically in the oil and gas and marine space, starting from the top, we have the education and competence. This has become very key to growth, especially with the way market conditions have gone over the last 2 years with the oil price. It's been ever more increasingly important that in your cluster you have expertise and high level of skills and almost like theoretical and innovative ideas that are continually springing forth. And a way to do this is via educational institutions. So interacting with your universities or colleges or institutes, and in fact in that interaction, also ensuring that it is targeted towards the cluster you're in. So making more science and maths and marine available subjects in those institutions that you're dealing with, so you have the constant flow of that fresh thinking, new minds, and real development. And going down, just looking at the market access, I've already touched on that you're able in a cluster to leverage off what the cluster offers. Each of the players in turn is able to almost piggyback off that marketing that is done. So if you have the best, like a shipyard, whoever supplies in there, if that shipyard is well marketed, you in turn, by saying you service that shipyard, automatically gain that same status of that shipyard. And so you find consultants, ship equipment, oil companies that are particularly centered around a more popular, more prestigious, or has a good reputation cluster, in turn get the natural benefits of that marketing. Then the entrepreneurship is something that's really growing strong. In that space, you find small business. So in our South African context is where you would find the small and medium enterprises. And they also help to glue some of the work, because you would have perhaps, sometimes with the big companies or the multinationals that have been operating for many, many years, they do need that fresh thinking from entrepreneurs. Some of the things they've been stuck on in how to improve the processes. And by nature, entrepreneurs always look at things a little outside the box. So you want to bring them into your cluster to continually help you look at things a bit outside the box to differentiate yourself from other clusters. And then, very important, the risk capital. It's becoming, especially globally, there's less and less dependence on government subsidies and grants. We may not be there yet in South Africa, but that's the general trend, in that, yes, there is funding from government, yes, there's various incentives, I'll cover some of them even later on, and also financial institutions offering loans and so forth. But what's actually very important also for sustainability of the clusters is that businesses become commercialized, so they have a commercial driver. And if they do well, the cluster does well, because then you obviously have the spin-offs from there. There's less and less dependency perhaps on some of the supporting functions, and they start to add into the cluster rather than just being benefactors of it. Then I have here where I say more than a triple helix. So there's a sort of a way of looking at collaboration between institutions, and the more commonly used term, especially in the South African context, is the triple helix, which includes industry, the education, research and development, and government. So there's this thinking that within those three spheres, you're able to get into spaces of innovation, of looking into incubation of businesses and other ideas of how we can grow the economy. However, I found that the MIT, which is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the USA, is one of the top institutions when it comes to innovation. Just the way that subjects are taught there. So they have a program called the Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program, and they've taken a triple helix and added to it and said, these discussions are all great between industry, the research and development and education institutions and government, but you must include in there the capital. When we say capital, like I've mentioned, the funders, your venture capitalists, your angel investors, they need to be part of the same conversation of how they can also assist in growing the economy. And of course, the entrepreneurs, as I've mentioned, being the people often who spring off and make clusters unique with their varied inputs and how you can go about business as usual. So in the next topic, I'd just like to cover, I'll just touch on what the maritime clusters typically look like. And the reason for that is, of course, the Saldanha Bay IDZ is working within the oil and gas and marine/maritime cluster. And so you will find there's certain overlaps in terms of some of our service offerings and what you'd find in a pure maritime cluster. And the reason for that is the IDZ is designated over the port of Saldanha Bay, so you start to step into that maritime space. And in your typical cluster, in fact, in the port of Saldanha Bay, you almost have most of these, where you've got all the way from activities around the services. There could be shipbuilding coming through with the IDZs. You've got marine equipment being manufactured, fishing, fish farming. We've got the aquaculture cages in the bay, dredging activities where you need to get a little bit more depth into your quayside. The Navy in some instances, and just typical shipping activities which you see in the port as well. These all need to coexist. And going back to the beginning where I say, where you compete when you must, but otherwise you work together, is that you can choose, if you have in clusters, like say in the port, you could choose to look in each of your individual spaces as, oh, they in my space, they impacting with my business, like almost like they the anti-Christ to what I'm trying to do. Or you could actually look at, well, we're all in the maritime sector. There's certain common themes on what we do, and we can leverage off that. So to demonstrate that, then you get. So this is an example of a Latvian cluster that's in Europe, and what they have there is just a pool. So in what's common across everyone operating in the maritime cluster is you've got your ship owners, the shipping agents, harbour services, maritime and training institutions, and surrounding that is the education, as I mentioned, which can be tied into maritime studies, science and technology innovations. You've got the services of your financial institutions, which you need to operate. The Navy I've mentioned. Tourism can come into it as well, and so you start to have in the center there, these service providers can actually provide their services to all of these various sectors or have some role to play. And what happens is that then you have a knowledge sharing and you start to grow expertise because you've got certain key players who have an overview to all that is happening there, and they can just start to bring in what other innovative ideas could become, what other efficiencies can be brought into the operations. And that's very, very important for the sustainability of, in fact, of certain ports. That may well be the way in which they survive. In the South African context, so in terms of looking at the maritime and the clustering, if you will, SAIMI, which is the South African International Maritime Institute, has been recently formed, I think about a year or two ago, in Port Elizabeth. And under Operation Phakisa, what they're trying to do is to make them become the hosts of a national maritime cluster. I attended a session in April, May, where where Operation Phakisa was speaking about how can we get, from a previous slide, all those players together to be able to find common grounds of operation so that they are able to work together where they need to. And of course, you still retain your competitive advantage for other business that grows your own individual company or service offering. And an example that was made during that session actually was of the eThekwini Maritime Cluster in Durban. And the Etiquette Maritime Cluster, actually, currently they focus, if you went onto their website, they are just trying to bring awareness of the maritime cluster, like just as a starting point, in terms of they've gone to certain schools and introduced subjects that have to do with maritime studies. There's certain programs that allow incubation for people who are part of that service provision. They just recently have made a call out to all unemployed engineers, and we know there's lots of them actually lying out there because it's just difficult to find work, because they want to build a program because they can see that there is skill probably lies in certain pockets and it just needs to be centralized, but you've got to centralize it around something. So they're centralizing it around the maritime cluster. And it's a non-profit organization, company, the way it's run. And in partnership obviously with Transit and certain players who are involved in that space, and they're looking at how you improve your logistics or your cargo processes, how shipping agents process timelines can work, and it's actually quite a great initiative and a good example actually that we have something like that in South Africa that's springing up. And in that same light, we hope as an IDZ to be that future oil and gas clustering model as well, of how you get upstream service providers and players to coexist within a particular space. And now I'll go on to specifically the oil and gas cluster. So this is just an image of the offshore operations, where you have your drill ships here, petrol supply vessels. The image is showing at the bottom the subsea network where the drilling takes place and all the equipment surrounding it. And when I looked at this picture, I actually thought, in essence, the offshore oil fields operate in clusters. You cannot do any of these operations with just one, say with one particular offering or one particular type of work or one service provider. There's people who focus solely on the subsea manufacturing and operation. But that work means nothing without people who are providing the rigs that are on the surface or above water, or the ships that are going to be extracting the crude oil and natural gas and transport it to shore, to the market, or the platform supply vessels or the petrol supply vessels that are there to also serve a function of bringing in supplies, providing security. So by its nature, the sector that we as IDZ are operating in is it works in a clustering form, because there's even in fact for if you have a drilling field, so there's a license for extracting the crude oil, that particular field is never owned by one company. You'll find that maybe Total will put in a stake of 25%, Shell will come in with 15%, someone else will come with another percentage, another player, maybe just a financial provider, they're not necessarily an oil company, comes in and says, I will provide this, because they understand the importance of sharing that risk, but also, sharing the risk, but also knowing that we can all have a piece of the pie, and that's what makes it work, than just one person wanting to actually go into that alone. This is a schematic of what we often use to demonstrate the oil and gas and marine value chain, and it's been adapted for the IDZ. And I brought it in because this is a cluster in itself as well, in the sense that you've got your suppliers and suppliers of your raw materials that come into this, because you're obviously working a lot with say shipbuilding, fabrication and construction of steel or material or products, machines, tools. They have their space within the IDZ, but they can't just service steel to no off-taker. So you need then someone in the zone, and then that's how the relationship works. And then you would have, like I've mentioned, the oil and gas industry suppliers. You have people who purely focus on subsea, purely focus on topside, drilling and well technology. These people are in these specialist areas, but on their own, they actually have no business case, because they need the rest to make it a viable company or a viable service offering. And then we speak of related clusters such as transportation, logistics, business services. We speak of education and research institutions as well. And you can't, and even with that, it's not just one, because maybe, for example, CPUT has a marine kind of school where they offer some of the training for offshore as well as cadets for vessels, but you would find that UWC doesn't have that, but UWC has a very good program on petroleum geology for their master's students, which is the only one that's specifically designed in petroleum geology. So you also then need them to cluster for offering the service to the IDZ. And then collaborations from various institutions. SAOGA, which is South African Oil and Gas Alliance, they look after the companies who provide services, they service companies to the upstream oil and gas sectors, whereas OPASA, which is the Offshore Petroleum Agency South Africa, they are the oil companies, so they're the people who actually own the fleets, and they're doing a lot of the work that is offshore. So they've got different activities, and so together then we get the full offering of who we need to service. Then of course you get specialized services around accounting, law firms, very critical role players to be in there because of the services that are required. And from this, as the IDZ, we've managed to synthesize and get to what we call our 5 key area focus of clustering, and that being repairs and maintenance, so just the grouping in terms of what the service provision is, ancillary services, I'll cover that much later on in the slides, logistics. I have an example in terms of marine subsea engineering and fabrication of what, although this is the overall cluster, you can go into sublayers and sublayers of within that cluster resides another cluster, as demonstrated in this next slide. So at a high level, the IDZ has a fabrication and construction cluster or component that is part of the Saldanha Bay IDZ's Oil and Gas and Marine Services cluster. But that one particular cluster itself has a whole string below of service providers that make it work, that make it function, ranging from just the hard works and the supplies and welding and valve manufacture, going through to training that's required to be able to work in the HR and IT services, quality assurance and quality control. So it all works together in that sense, and it's a clustering. And I'm laboring on the points, but it's just to show that, I'll show in the last example actually how the concept is actually really good, but you have to view it in that way, otherwise it's just individuals trying to do business together. So you almost have to formalize it, and then it actually is powerful and meaningful. I just wanted to touch on special economic zones, because that's so we as the Saldanha Bay IDZ, which is Industrial Development Zone, so the Industrial Development Zones were formed back in 2001 in South Africa as a means to stimulate economic development and job creation in certain pockets around the country where it was felt, there's a high level of unemployment, people aren't able to access jobs because there are no real kind of companies or opportunities for them to be able to do work in those areas. So the government sort of planted these industrial development zones. And then in 2014, the SEZ Act came into place, which is the Special Economic Zones Act. And this is just to align everything a little bit better. And now there's an act under which we work, and there's certain incentives, or there's certain mandates that now the previous industrial development zones and the new special economic zones that are being formed can operate, and it allows for real growth, because some of the IDZs, they were started, but they struggled to get off the ground, and some of them did take off, and then they plateaued. So you need a mechanism. Just like in classroom, you do need a mechanism that will ensure this growth and track record. So just to touch, I know it's a bit small, but we do send the presentations out afterwards, just for your own reading, is that under the Special Economic Zones tax incentive regime, so that's one of the draw cards that at least the Department of Trade and Industry, who is the custodian of the SEZ tax incentive regime, has offered VAT and customs relief. So if you are an investor operating within the zone and you have imported goods, so it's raw materials, for value add and re-export, then you're not liable for paying VAT and customs duty on those goods, which is a great help in considering the value of some of the products that come through, especially with regards to the oil and gas industry. 14% can make a significant amount to your cash flow. And then there's an offering of the employment tax incentive. There already exists an employment tax incentive, however it's capped at 35 years old, so it's for the youth, so I think it's 18 to 35 years old. But for the zone, they've taken off that age cap, so all companies or employers can be eligible for this tax. There is a particular, obviously, terms and conditions and calculation of how you can access this, but that's a great help and a great boost to encourage business people who are operating in the zone to employ young people or to get people into entry-level jobs, particularly those who haven't been working before. It gives the opportunity for them to enter the job market. And then there's a reduced corporate income tax. Now this has a very strong clause that has to be strictly adhered to. If you perform 90% of your function, so if you are, say you're doing a shipbuilding, 90% of that activity has to take place within the zone. So you couldn't have built your maybe just only the hull in the zone, but your entire engine room and top structures and accommodation is built elsewhere outside of the zone, and then just brought in, to be attached, and then you gain access to this reduction in corporate income tax. The idea is to encourage as much activity within the zone, then you capture the job market within that space, and also obviously it does just mean that in that pocket where there's so much need for business and jobs, it is kept within that particular space, and then then in return, the corporate income tax for those companies is reduced from 28% to 15%. And then there's also a building allowance. This is the special, again, formula with regards to when you bring in the equipment or the capital investment for your setting up of your operations. So if setting up your warehouse requires these, massive 10-ton cranes and particular like reinforced steel blocks, so the building of your facilities, there's incentive given in the fact that you are investing in the zone, investing in South Africa, especially if you're a foreign investor, but even just locally, and then it allows for you to have some tax breaks in that space. So I've touched on clustering, and I've just mentioned the special economic zones, which the mandate under which we operate, and I just wanted to draw that the two actually serve the same purpose. When you do clustering, the idea with clustering is that you want to create employment. You are avoiding having a single supplier that gets work maybe 3 times a month because they're just solo searching for contracts and searching for work. But in a cluster, there almost is a little bit of a stimulation of a little bit more work by being part of this community of service offering. And especially economic zones are designed to create employment. And then clusters also tend to attract local and foreign investment, so it is a tool to attract investment because of some of the costs that are leveraged in the way that it operates. And special economic zones are the same. They are there to attract investors into that particular space. So there's a bit of a energizing of that community to be part of the economy. They encourage SMMEs. I've mentioned that, especially through the space of entrepreneurship. And the special economic zones also, they for the most part, they also are a tool of the DTI, because the DTI is the custodian of the industrial policy plans. The triple BE codes are written by the DTI, so they are serving the purpose of getting small and medium enterprises, previously disadvantaged players who couldn't enter the market, to have a space in which they too can be able to participate in the economy. And the clusters provide a framework for growth. And as I mentioned, if all of these people in the cluster just operate on their own, and every now and again you might call the one person because you want to do a job together, it doesn't have the full effect. It doesn't reach its full potential unless it is actually in a framework, and there's a manner in which it is looked after. And therefore there's growth and tracking of the fact that it is being effective and introducing new players into it and so forth. Free trade zones. The concept of free trade zones also ties into, so with regards to special economic zones, they like I said, it's a demarcated area. It's for allowing economic activity. So there's something happening in the zone in terms of manufacturing, be it logistics. There's some activity that is happening there, but it's in concentrated area, and therefore it allows for almost like a growth around that particular space. And what has been seen as a key selling point, especially in the oil and gas industry, is when these zones operate as free trade zones or like as free ports, which is basically our goal as the Salona Bay IDZ. So I've just added in here for those who do want to perhaps have a look at how some of the other oil and gas clusters operate. And particularly if you go to their website, you'd start to see also what sort of service provision takes place, what sort of players are in that space, because sometimes we do get questions, Abby will tell you, from enterprise development, of people saying, how can we participate, or what opportunities are there for us? And I think, I just wanted to provide this list to say, have a look at some of these oil and gas clusters and what they do, and you could well find that, hey, I'm doing my business in this and that way, but actually there's room for me to tweak it in this manner when, you know, I want to actually be working or supplying the IDZ, or as an investor in the IDZ itself. So I'll just also leave that up, and there's many more. It's a growing phenomena. China definitely being top on the list. I think every other city in China is a special economic zone with, you know, certain dispensation given to people in that area, and it's working really well. I mean, they have a very large population, and there simply cannot be enough employment for everybody, but there's a lot of innovation and entrepreneurship that is really stimulated out of these clusters in the country, and actually South Africa has also taken some of the lessons from the Chinese model, various Chinese models. Just an example in terms of the free ports in Africa. So we have functional oil and gas free zones or free ports, or marine. So Mauritius, for example, Mauritius operates as a free port, and for a small island, they've really managed to capture quite a large sort of market share in the shipping industry. You know, they supply all the other, you know, islands, kind of the Indian Ocean islands, because they made sure that they built their ports correctly. They have the right services, they've got the right kind of connection around the port. I've actually visited the port when I used to work in shipping, and it's incredible that a small island like that would get this clustering concept and try to squeeze the space. There was also another area where it was textile, and I couldn't believe they were supplying Woolworths clothing. We don't even supply it. We don't make Woolworths clothes, and Mauritius makes it, but it's our brand. And I thought, how do we get there? But you have to position yourself, and then there's the tourism is unbelievable in terms of how also it's been, you know, clustered and structured. So I'm going off at a tangent, but it's just the clustering thing really works well, but it's got to be structured. And in Ane, which is Nigeria's got so many free trade zones popping up because at a government level, they've set up sort of an organization where they've got certain rules, what you need to apply to be able to operate as a free trade area. And even a private person, if I had the money, I'd just go in and apply, and I said, I would like to set up a Benedicta free trade oil and gas. Here's my land area that I found. This is what kind of activities we'll have. Maybe these are one of the investors that I've already secured. This is the job creation, GDP returns that I will give you as a result of this. And you know, you fill out the business case, and you can start up actually a free trade zone. So they've made it that simple, and you find that within that area, there's just a lot of economic activity because it's focused as well. So different countries have different models, and we also as the IDZ have been looking at these various models, especially in my role in the ease of doing business, of what can we take and implement in our environment, because of course you can't plug and play from other countries. It's completely different environments, different geography, political just will and things like that. So it's just important though just to note that there's really good examples out there also for yourselves to look at. Just as a closing remark, I have quite passionately spoken about this, but I do believe that clustering is the key to success. And my presentation was actually ending here until Abigail said, "No, man, you must give a real life example," because you know, I guess from her end, she does get a lot of walk-ins of people saying, how can we be a part of this? I'm just a small cleaning services company, or I just bake cakes, and this is not even getting to the high end of I supply electronic, pneumatic kind of pipes and equipment, and I need to find someone to be an off-taker. We're just like at grassroots level. So I did just try and put together a grassroots level kind of clustering that. This is not the Bible, this is just my kind of trying to define the concept. So say you had an accommodation cluster. Just you pick something very simple, accommodation, and the accommodation cluster itself is, it's well managed, and in there you've got maybe a hotel, you've got a guest house, you've got some B&Bs, 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, they sleep 10, they sleep 100, combination of it, but basically you have a cluster. Now just that standing alone, we've often spoken, especially last year when I used to talk about like what the requirements of the rigs and the vessels. You could find that a rig has come in, they're doing a bit of work, the work is extended for a certain period of time, they need 300 beds. Now, there's no one, I mean, like they should book out a hotel, but even in those cases, sometimes there's not enough rooms. The way that you could actually say, right, pick up our hands, we can do that for you, is if you had a cluster. So in that particular case, you have a rig that came in, they want 300 beds. This clustering, organization and accommodation says, right, we've got 300 beds. They don't care where those 300 beds are. You can obviously have the details of some of them 1-star, 2-star, whatever, the pricing. You could work it out that everyone gives a flat rate because they'll be going into one particular tender offering. But the point is you are able to actually then offer that service because the rigs don't want to have to go to each of these individual people and split their crews. They want one person to be responsible for that accommodation service offering. So then you have that. That does by no means mean that the people within the cluster cannot operate on their own. It doesn't mean that if someone did get a VP coming into one of the companies within the zone and they're looking for a nice 3-star guest house, that they couldn't just go and get the contract on their own, even though they're part of the cluster. So that's the important thing, is that you collaborate where you need to, and you can also compete, and it keeps it healthy. So that's the accommodation cluster. But what actually the accommodation cluster springs off is kind of starting from the right side, a cleaning service cluster. So all of these accommodations, so if you had this one cluster of accommodation, they need to be serviced in terms of cleaning. It could be that each person has got their own individual person, or the cleaning, or people who have the service offering cluster amongst themselves, and then they form their own clustering service, again, because it does mean that you're going to one central point. And within the clustering service, you could have people who provide the actual cleaners and be trained, if they're in kind of specialist cleaning things that they need to have, techniques. They could have a supplier of the detergents that are used. You can have a supplier of the equipment that are the brooms, your mops, and you can have a supplier of the cleaning uniforms. Now, out of the cleaning service, which is cleaning all of the accommodation people, you've got your own cleaning cluster, which actually has people who are in their own individual service offerings coming into it. And they make it work. And you start to leverage the cost, because now you're not someone's buying a handy from so-and-so and whatever, domestic from this one. You've got an actual structured service provision. You leverage the cost because you're buying in bulk, because you're servicing 300 beds, as a cluster of perhaps 10 cleaning service companies that have X amount of people, and so forth, and so it grows. Now, looking into transportation, same thing. You could have a transportation cluster. The transportation cluster could work for this accommodation option, in that they transport people from the accommodation to the IDZ, to the rigs, depending where the work is. Or they got the contracts themselves directly from a particular investor in the zone who just had a massive project that suddenly came up, and they need to shuttle a lot of people. So you can operate in and out. The transportation can comprise of, some people just have the fleet. They just own cars and they can bring that to the fore. Someone else has licensed drivers. They make sure that drivers are well trained in etiquette. They got the right licensing and so forth, and that's their input into the cluster. Someone supplies the uniform, so you just have to have a nice look and feel, and it makes it more professional. And then someone, you can be a couple of guys who look after the repairs and maintenance of this fleet that you're operating, to make sure that you never are now suddenly there was an order, 3 of the cars don't work, don't know where to go, suddenly calling up, there's no space in a repair service. You've got that already fixed into your cluster. And then just general services of the upkeep of an accommodation block. You've got need plumbers, you need gardening services, you need people from the hospitality industry in terms of administration, front desk, and so forth. Electricity, a range of things that any accommodation place requires, and it can be clustered. And then last but not least, catering. You can have, then again, people who provide the food. People who just provide cutlery and crockery, that's their business. But they form part of the cluster and they make it work for catering. Trained cooks, bakers, baristas, people who just supply drinks, the list is endless. But all of that I'm trying to demonstrate here is that the clustering methodology or system works really well, but you've got to think of it in that sense, because then you start to see who should form part of that particular cluster. You also don't want to grow it bigger than it needs to be, and you don't want to make it too small, but it's going to be focused. So that's why I made an example like this, where you just focus on anything that has to do with that particular service. And then what happens is the people who provide the service to us, they themselves grow, and then you start to get a really sustainable business model for a plumbing person who previously had just 3 jobs, maybe, 3 times they have visits in one of these guest houses a week, but now because they're in the cluster, there's almost, you could find there's even like a scheduled checks that they do, and maybe there's innovative ways that they see in other places that they can pass on to others, and so that system grows. Thank you for listening. Just before we end off, we've been using the Protea Hotel, who've been very gracious to allow us to have this beautiful venue, and actually they've gone one step further today. So if you look under your seats, we have a prize, but it's not for everybody. So if you just want to take a look under your seats, under some chairs there actually is a voucher that has been given to us by the Protea, and that's just from us to say thank you for your support. And the chair next to you. Okay. Thank you for your time and for listening.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, do you understand what I mean by feeling spoiled? I was sitting there and thinking, I hope everyone's minds is as all over the place as mine. What we want to achieve by these sessions is for you to think about where your business fits into this. So I would like for all of you to go away today and think about the cluster you would belong to and what your cluster would look like. So in going forward with the IDZ, I think we will be having meetings with the different sectors. So when we come back, we expect you to think about what your cluster would look like and how we go forward with this. Because the objective is for us to present a database of competitive, compliant businesses to the investors. So we still have time before the IDZ lands their first investor, and I need to tell you that our managers want us to have this database of competitive, compliant businesses going forward. So we do have a lot of work to do, so join us for coffee, and network amongst each other. Find your cluster. Until next month, see you. Thank you.